If you had asked the average family 50 years ago what made a household safe, they would have given you a very different answer than the one modern life keeps repeating. Today we are told the safe family is the two-income family, two salaries, two careers, two R-phase, some phase, two adults moving as fast as possible through the work week. So the numbers keep working. That sounds rational. It sounds modern. It sounds like progress. And because it sounds like progress, almost nobody stops to ask why so many of these supposedly stronger households feel so weak. That is the question I want to talk about. Not because I have some romantic fantasy about the past, I do not. Not because I think one arrangement is morally superior to another. I do not think that either. I care about incentives, I care about structure. I care about what happens to families when they build a life around both engines running all the time and then wonder why one bad month feels like a personal emergency. I have spent most of my life around businesses, balance sheets, incentives, consumer behavior, and the countless ways intelligent people can be trapped by systems that look safe only from a distance. The older I get, the less impressed I become by gross income and the more interested I become in margin. Margin is where safety lives, not in the story you tell yourself when the paychecks arrive. Margin room slack, the ability to absorb a hit without the whole machine beginning to shake. That is what many two-income households have quietly lost. The source document you gave me captures the problem very well. It describes a couple earning a combined $133,000, one in marketing at $62,000 and one in it at $71,000, which places them comfortably above the national middle in gross terms, and yet they are still stressed, thin on savings, carrying surprise repairs on a credit card, and feeling as though they are doing everything right while somehow still drowning. It then frames the larger concept as the two-income trap, citing Elizabeth Warren and Amelia Warren Tyagi,'s work on bankruptcy and the surprising idea that two working parents often became more financially vulnerable, not less. Fay-Felicite, Fay-Turn 88, File 0 Fay. That is exactly the kind of paradox that deserves attention, because at first glance the arithmetic seems too obvious to challenge. If one person earning $50,000 can support a family, then two people earning $50,000 each should create a much safer family. That is simple addition, but family finance is not only addition, it is behavior plus incentives, plus fixed costs, plus social pressure, plus what happens when the extra income becomes the floor instead of the surplus. That is how a mathematical advantage turns into a structural trap. The trap begins with a story. The story says two incomes are stronger than one. At a very shallow level, that is true. Two checks are bigger than one check. But once the whole market knows that two checks have become normal, the market begins pricing against those two checks. Housing does not remain priced for one-income families if two-income families become the dominant bidders. School districts do not remain economically neutral if ambitious households start using two salaries to crowd into the same neighborhoods. Childcare does not stay optional when both adults are away from home all day. Commuting costs do not stay theoretical when two adults each must move through traffic, parking, depreciation, insurance, and all the rest. The second income does not arrive untouched and then politely wait to become wealth. It enters a system that has already been redesigned to absorb it. That is the great financial bait and switch. The source explains this historical turn in a way I think is very useful. It notes that in 1970, roughly 43% of women participated in the workforce, and that the typical middle-class family often relied on one primary breadwinner with one parent at home. It then argues that this single income structure, whatever its cultural limits, came with something economically powerful. One income was often enough to cover a median-priced home basic family needs and still leave margin, while the second adult represented a kind of reserve capacity that could enter the workforce if something went wrong. By contrast, in the modern period, female labor force participation is much higher. Dual-income households have become the default, and the extra income has been swallowed by housing, healthcare, childcare, and education costs that have risen much faster than families expected. The source points specifically to median home prices moving from roughly $200,000 in 1970 inflation-adjusted terms to over $400,000 in 2023, along with major increases in healthcare, childcare, and education costs. Fay-Felicite, Fay-Turn 88, File 0 Fay, that is the key. The second income did not mostly become wealth. It became the new minimum ante for the same table. That is why so many households feel as though they are running twice as hard for the right to stand in the same place. This is not simply personal failure. It is market adaptation. The family adds a second earner. The market does not say thank you and step aside. The market says good, now you can bid more. And once enough families do that, nobody ends up with an advantage. The price structure simply resets. Housing is the clearest example of this because housing is where status, schooling, safety, and identity all get tangled together. A family does not only buy a house, it buys a school district, a commute, a peer group, a set of assumptions about what kind of family it is. And because families are emotional creatures, not rational robots, those assumptions become incredibly powerful. When two incomes become normal, banks qualify larger mortgages, families stretch a little further, then another family stretches a little more, then another, and before long the price of reasonable has moved so far upward that one income can no longer touch what one income once handled comfortably. That is what makes the trap so vicious. It does not announce itself as a trap, it arrives disguised as a smarter, safer, more ambitious life. Now, let me show you where the math turns cruel. The second income looks wonderful in gross form. That is how families make the mistake. They see the total salary, they do not see the net contribution. The source walks through a clean example. One partner earns $70,000, the other $50,000, for a combined household income of $120,000. The second income looks large enough to transform the family's finances. But then the source subtracts taxes, often 30 to 35% or more on that marginal income when federal, state, and payroll taxes are combined. Then it subtracts child care, using around $15,000 per child as a national average, and much higher in expensive areas. Then it adds commuting-related costs, second vehicle costs, and what it calls exhaustion expenses, meaning prepared food, delivery, household help, and the convenience spending that often rises when two tired adults have no time margin left by the end of that exercise. The source says a $50,000 second income can shrink to something like $2,000 in true annual net contribution, maybe less, maybe negative, depending on circumstances. Fay file a site, Fay turn 88 file 0 Fay. That is the point at which the whole myth should collapse because the second income is not competing against zero. It is competing against the costs required to make the second income possible and the enlarged cost structure created after both incomes became the baseline. That is a very different comparison. And once you start thinking that way, 1,000 modern household mysteries stop being mysterious. Why does the family feel broke even though the tax return says 6 figures? Because gross income is not spendable margin. Why does the house feel heavy even though the bank approved it? Because the bank underwrote 2 salaries, not resilience. Why does a single repair feel like a small crisis? Because the household did not gain a second surplus stream. It often just activated the backup engine and then built a larger machine that needs both engines continuously. That last part may be the most important point in the whole conversation. The older single-income household had an invisible asset many modern households have spent without noticing. Reserve earning capacity if one person lost a job. The second adult could potentially enter the workforce. Not ideal, not painless. But the family had an option today, as the source argues. Many two-income households have already used that option as the base case. The backup plan is no longer a backup. It is the default operating mode. Both adults are already producing at full effort, just to keep the fixed monthly obligations alive. When one engine fails, there is no reserve engine left to activate. Fay file a site, Fay turn 88 file 0 Fay. That is what fragility looks like. Not low income necessarily. Not even bad habits necessarily. Fragility means there is no slack left in the design. A system running at 100% capacity can look impressive right up until the moment something ordinary goes wrong. Then it stops looking impressive and starts looking frightening. That is why I think this subject is really about margin for error. The source says Warren's research found two-income families were more likely to go bankrupt, not because they were reckless, but because they had no room for mistake. They were using both incomes to support fixed commitments that could not tolerate interruption. That insight matters much more than the politics of the phrase two-income trap. Fay file a site, Fay turn 88 file 0 Fay. I agree. The trap is not that two incomes exist. The trap is that the lifestyle, housing, schools, and monthly obligations have all been built in such a way that both incomes are no longer a choice. They are a requirement. Once that happens, a household is not rich. It is leveraged not in the hedge fund sense, in the human sense, leveraged to health, leveraged to job stability, leverage to child care continuity, leverage to two adults continuing to perform at a high level indefinitely, no matter what aging parents, illness, burnout, relocation, layoffs, or special family needs arrive in the middle. That is too much pressure for most lives. This is why I have never trusted the phrase, "we can afford it," when it is based on two incomes at full stretch. Afford is one of the most dangerous words in family finance because it hides the exact question that matters. Can you afford it if one thing stops cooperating? If the answer is no, then perhaps you do not really afford it. Perhaps you merely support it under favorable operating conditions. That is not the same thing. Now, I want to talk about the social side of the trap because money is never only arithmetic. The source is very good on this too. It says the fixed costs consuming the second income are often not luxury toys at all. They are housing, childcare, healthcare, education, and the non-negotiable expenses of what the culture now defines as participating respectably in the middle class. This is why the trap feels so unfair. People are not always blowing money on nonsense. They are often just buying the ticket of admission to the version of family life they were told was prudent. Fay file a site, Fay turn 88, file 0 Fay. That is what makes the trap psychologically powerful. It does not feel like indulgence. It feels like responsibility. You did not buy the giant house because you wanted to brag. You bought a decent house in a decent district because your children mattered and everyone told you that was what good parents do. You did not buy childcare because it was a luxury toy. You bought it because both adults had to work and somebody had to watch the children. You did not spend more on convenience because you are lazy. You spent more because two exhausted adults with long commutes and children cannot cook every ideal meal from scratch while also repairing the gutter and mowing the lawn and preserving their marriage. This is why moralizing about just spend less misses the deeper design problem. Some households absolutely do have discretionary nonsense to cut. Many do not have enough nonsense to explain the level of stress they feel. Their real problem is that the system around them got repriced for two incomes, and the backup plan was consumed the moment they decided to behave normally. That is why I think the best solution in the source is also the most countercultural one. Treat the second income as temporary even if it is not. That sentence sounds almost absurd to modern ears. How can a family that needs two incomes survive by pretending one is temporary? But that is exactly the point. The source argues for what it calls a one-income foundation. Fixed costs should be structured as much as possible, so one income can cover the non-negotiable monthly load. The second income then becomes the margin layer, emergency fund, debt destruction, retirement saving, investing, and yes, perhaps some improvements in life, but not obligations that would collapse the family. If the second income disappeared, it gives a concrete example of a $130,000 household deliberately choosing a mortgage that a $60,000 income can support rather than building the whole household around what the full $130,000 could technically qualify for. Fay Felicite, Fay turn 88, file 0 Fay, that is one of the wisest ideas in the whole field of family finance, because it transforms the second income from oxygen into advantage. Oxygen is scary because you die without it. Advantage is powerful because you can direct it. Once the second income is no longer a required input for survival, the whole emotional climate of the household changes. A job loss is still painful, a health shock is still painful, a child with new needs is still difficult, but the event is no longer immediately existential. That is what money is supposed to buy, not vanity margin. Now I want to make this even more practical. What does a one-income foundation really mean? It means the mortgage payment has to be chosen by a different standard, not what two incomes can barely or even comfortably service in normal times, what one income can carry without heroics. It means the transportation burden has to be chosen by a different standard too, not what looks normal in the parking lot of your neighborhood, what leaves the family able to breathe if one adult stops earning. It means activity spending for children, neighborhood choice, school assumptions, renovation decisions, and recurring subscriptions all have to be filtered through one much harsher question. Does this lock us into both incomes forever? That is the question most households never ask until the trap is already closed. The source says that within 5 to 10 years of following this approach, something magical begins to happen because the second income, no longer consumed by baseline obligations, starts building real wealth. Emergency reserves get funded, retirement accounts fill, taxable investments grow. Compounding begins to create the genuine security people thought two incomes would automatically provide in the first place. Fay file site, Fay turn 88, file 0 Fay. That is the irony, two incomes do not automatically create security. Two incomes disciplined correctly can create security. Those are entirely different propositions. The first is a myth. The second is a design choice. I also think the source is exactly right when it says that every dollar invested from the second income is buying back optionality. That phrase should be taken seriously. An invested dollar is not only money, it is future permission. Permission for one adult to step back. Permission to take a lower stress job. Permission to handle a parent's illness. Permission to survive a layoff with dignity. Permission to choose Fay-Philosite, Fay-Turn, 88, File 0, Fay choice is what the modern two-income household has often lost. And once choice is lost, even high earners start living like hostages. That is the emotional truth underneath all of this. The family may look prosperous, the salary may sound impressive, the neighborhood may reassure other people. But if neither adult can stop, pause, recover, pivot, or absorb bad luck without the whole machine threatening collapse, then the household is not wealthy in any meaningful sense. It is simply expensive. This is why I care so much about what I call the quality of earnings. A salary is not only a number, its quality depends on what the household needs it to do. One income that is enough is high quality. Two incomes both already spent before they arrive are much lower quality, even if the gross number sounds far better. The source puts this beautifully in its closing lines. It says, appearances are not wealth, cash flow is not security, and two incomes are not better than one if both of them are already spent before they arrive. It argues that the families who actually thrive are not necessarily the ones who earn the most, but the ones who preserve flexibility and refuse to let expenses expand to consume every dollar. Let's put aside Fay-Turn 88, File 0, Fay. That is exactly where I would end too. Not with blame, not with nostalgia, not with a lecture about one spouse staying home or the other spouse sacrificing a career. That is not the real lesson. The real lesson is that safety comes from preserving reserve capacity. If your life uses every available engine just to stay in place, then you are not strong. You are maxed out, and maxed out systems can look normal for years before one shock reveals how little room they actually had. So if I were speaking to a young couple today, I would say this. Do not ask how much life your combined income can buy. Ask how much of your life can survive if one income disappears. Do not ask what the bank will approve. Ask what leaves your family with a backup plan. Do not assume that because you make more than your parents did, you are safer than they were. You may simply be playing a more expensive game, and if you want real security, you have to build it deliberately. One fixed cost at a time, one refusal at a time, one investment of the second income at a time, one act of restraint at a time. That is not flashy. It is not exciting. It is not the story culture likes to sell. It is, however, how freedom is actually built. And freedom, once built, is worth much more than the appearance of prosperity ever was. There is another part of this trap that deserves more respect because it hides inside virtue education. The source is right to say that good public schools often get priced into expensive neighborhoods through property taxes and local demand. That means the family is not just buying shelter. It is buying educational opportunity through the mortgage, often without admitting that this is what is happening. Once enough ambitious families begin using two incomes to compete for the same school districts, the school district stops being a public good in the emotional sense and starts behaving like an auction good. The household tells itself it is being responsible. The market hears only one thing. They can pay more. Fay-Philosite, Fay-Turn 88, File 0, Fay. That is why the trap feels morally confusing. The family is not being decadent. It is trying to be prudent. That is what makes the whole machine so expensive. You are not paying extra because you want nonsense. You are paying extra because the culture made virtue expensive. Now, once you see that, you also see why the answer cannot be purely emotional. No amount of guilt fixes a system problem. What helps is redesign. If I were trying to apply the lesson in the most practical way possible, I would tell a household to do three things. First, calculate fixed costs as though one income vanished tomorrow. Not because it will, because you need to know whether the household is resilient or merely functioning. Second, isolate the second income and give it explicit jobs before lifestyle grabs it. Emergency reserves, debt elimination, retirement accounts, taxable investments, not vague hopes, specific jobs. Third, define what level of house. School car, child care, and convenience. Spending still leaves the family with dignity if one adult has to stop earning for a year. That is the real test. A life that passes that test is not small, it is strong. Most people are chasing a bigger looking life. They should be chasing a life with more room. Room is what lets a family absorb illness without panic. Room is what lets one parent stay home for a season if a child needs more help. Room is what lets someone refuse a toxic boss. Room is what lets a layoff become a problem rather than a catastrophe. That is what the second income should be buying. Not a larger monthly nut, not a prettier version of being trapped. Margin, optionality, breathing room. That is the real luxury. And once a household understands that, the entire conversation changes. The goal is no longer to prove that two incomes can support more life. The goal is to use two incomes to buy back the freedom that one-income households used to have by default. That is a much wiser ambition. And in the long run, it is the one that actually compounds into security.